Yes, so we're going to look at the big 5 personality traits today, and what I'm intending to do is, I guess, put them in the context of, well, what does it really mean for investment decision making? So I'm going to reflect on some aspects that relate to professional investment decision making and say, well, which parts of these then might also relate to individual investment decision making as well. So we'll look at what those big 5 traits are, how they relate to individual professionals. I'm going to look at some of the challenges also in interpreting personalities. So, for example, when you sort of introspect and think about your own personality versus trying to interpret other people's personalities. So we'll go through those 3 things, and then because this is really just designed as a bit of a snapshot, a bit of an introduction to some of these sort of concepts, we'll then say, well, where can you get some further information, for example. Okay, so going on to the big 5 traits themselves. Well, why are we talking about the big 5? Many people probably have done various different personality tests, the Myers-Briggs, the DISC, for example. Well, what psychologists have done is they've looked at all these different types of personality tests and said, well, are there any sort of underlying aspects of all of these things? Each test might be using different labels to describe different things, but when you dig beneath the surface, are they really describing the same types of things? And when they've done that analysis, they've identified 5 big things. These are the big 5 personality traits. And then under those big 5, there's sort of subsets, sort of individual components of each of the big 5. So we're not going to go into the subsets at this point, but let's have a look at some of those big 5. Now you can remember them. The easy way to remember what these big 5 traits are is with the acronym OCEAN, all right, which is the idea behind this slide here. So let's go through them. So starting with O. O stands for openness. So openness in this case is referring to whether somebody is imaginative, are they curious, are they open to new information and experiences and to unconventional ideas. So that's at the open end of the spectrum versus people who prefer to stick with more traditional, more concrete, perhaps more practical types of thinking at the other end of the spectrum. So that's O. Then you've got conscientiousness. So conscientiousness now is people who are more diligent. They tend to be more persistent or motivated, have a high level of self-control. So that's at the conscientious end of the spectrum. And then at the other end, you've got people who are perhaps more easygoing, less diligent, perhaps a bit more disorganized. So that's C. Then you've got extraversion. So probably people are familiar with the idea of extroverts and introverts. So the extroverts tend to be more sociable, more outgoing, get their energy from social interactions, versus introverts who typically, I guess, are more introspective, more reserved in their interactions. So that's extraversion. Then agreeableness. So agreeableness now relates to things like, someone who's high on agreeableness will tend to be more warm, more friendly, more trusting. At the other end of the spectrum, low agreeableness means you're perhaps more cynical, more suspicious, less trusting, more individualistic perhaps in the way you like to do things. And then you've got the 5th one there, neuroticism, which sort of sounds like a thing you don't want to have. But really it means sort of how emotional are you? So do you tend to get stressed, for example? Do you tend to react in investment context to market cycles, to things going up and down? Is that you, or do you tend to be able to sort of set your emotions aside to a greater extent and focus on other things? So they're the big 5, and bearing in mind we're not one of these things, we are some measure of each of these 5 things. So you could be high or low or medium on any of these 5 things. You'll therefore have a combination of probably some highs and some lows and some moderates. And really it's the combination that's important and which sort of things are particularly going to stand out in different contexts that's then going to be relevant for your investment decision making. And I'm not going to go into the detail of the combinations today, but we're at least going to touch on some of the major aspects that relate to these 5 individual traits and then sort of talk about how they might be relevant. Okay, so going through each in turn. So openness. So what does it mean for somebody who's more open? What does it mean for their investment decision making? Well, people who are high on openness tend to have a higher risk tolerance. Right? They tend to be more confident, but not overconfident. So there's a big chunk of behavioural research which talks about whether people become overconfident. There's a real problem of overconfidence. People think that they're better than they are. They think that they're more precise than they actually are. So there's a risk in being too confident. But the good thing about openness is that people who are open tend to be more confident. They're more willing to take risks, but they're not silly risks because open people tend to be both more confident and more accurate. So being open in that case is definitely a positive attribute compared with being obviously confident but not accurate, in which case you become overconfident. So if openness is associated with good investment decision making, why might that be? Well, one reason, for example, might be it is associated with lower confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the idea that people tend to seek out, pay attention to, look for information that confirms their existing beliefs versus disconfirming information. So open people are more likely to look for unconventional ideas, for being curious about why things might be different, and so that seems to align with the idea that they might be better at overcoming confirmation bias, as an example. But more generally, there's a fantastic set of research done by Philip Tetlock. He's written a couple of books, well worth a read, Expert Political Judgment and Super Forecasting, and he's looking at how well people can predict the future. And what he separated forecasters into two groups, right? Foxes and hedgehogs. And the foxes are the ones who are sort of more open and curious, bringing in different aspects of their decision making, and they tended to be more accurate than what he called the hedgehogs, who tended to have one big idea and they tended to be more fixed in the way that they were thinking. Right, so openness seems to be a good thing. Yes, you're more confident, but you're more accurate and you're more open to sort of some of these sort of alternatives. So moving on to the second one then, conscientiousness. So conscientiousness is somewhat similar to openness in that it's probably a good thing, but it's also quite different. So people who are high in conscientiousness tend to have a lower risk tolerance. All right, but what's going on here? Well, the lower risk tolerance and the conscientiousness, I mean, these are people who like sticking to processes, like having systems, like being methodical, like having self-discipline, for example. And when you look at some of the decision-making research, some of the problems that people can encounter relate to, for example, responding too much to market cycles or responding too much to specific characteristics of a stock versus looking at the broader subset of stocks or the universe that stock comes from. And having a rules-based sort of systematic approach actually is one of the ways that can then help overcome some of those problems, because it forces you to look at a range of different problems, set of rules that's going to apply in a range of different contexts, set those rules outside of the situation in which the emotions are going to apply. So rules-based approaches align with some of that decision-making process, and so if you're high in conscientiousness and more likely to follow some of that sort of rules-based discipline, well, understandably that's going to be an advantage for many people in their investment choices. And finally, the use of checklists. So when I go in to talk to professional investment teams, I'm not telling them stuff they don't already know about a particular stock or the market or anything like that. Sometimes all I'm trying to do is just say, hey, here's the sort of stuff that's likely to be overlooked, and when's it most likely to be overlooked? By which type of people, in which type of contexts? And so one of the ways to overcome that is just having a checklist, just to prompt you, to remind you to think about things, particularly when they're going to be overlooked and particularly relevant. So these are the types of things that people who are higher in conscientiousness are more likely, I guess, to be able to do. And if you happen to be lower in conscientiousness, these are the things that perhaps are your blind spots that you need to put more focus on to make sure that you're not missing. Okay, so moving on to the third one then. So this is extroverts versus introverts. Now, being an extrovert generally in life, I would say, is a fantastic advantage. Extroverts, being confident, for example, I mean, people who are confident tend to be confused with people who are competent. It's not to say those two things are necessarily separate, but being confident, actually, there's one fantastic study where people who are confident were judged as being more competent than competent people were, as an example. So extroverts are fantastic, particularly in sort of team environments where the sort of social dynamics of team situations are going to advantage extroverts versus introverts. However, in an investment context, it's not necessarily as clear-cut. So extroverts tend to have a higher risk tolerance, more likely to take risks, but unlike the people who are high in openness, who are perhaps taking wise risks, well, there's a risk that extroverts are just out there sort of taking unnecessary risks, looking for sensation, looking for excitement, for example. The other thing that concerns me, I guess, thinking about extroverts and thinking about sort of some of the decision-making biases that can underpin both professionals but individual judgment as well, is that those biases often relate to overlooking statistical processes and base rates and reversion to the mean and requiring introspection and quiet reflection and taking in a lot of information from different sources. And you look at people like Warren Buffett and he claims to read books for 8 hours a day or whatever it is. Right? These are not the sort of characteristics that tend to be associated with extroverts. These are more likely to be sort of introvert characteristics, sort of sitting there reading a book, reflecting, sort of thinking deeply about these sort of analytical processes. So when I go and talk to investment management teams, I'm talking to their analysts, I'm talking to their portfolio managers, I would say the most resounding characteristic that I would notice sort of on the outside looking in from these teams is they're full of introverts. So in that context, I would say I'd be looking for introverts as a positive characteristic, which again is not to say that extroverts aren't going to be good investors, but these are the sorts of things that you perhaps have to work harder to do if they don't come naturally to you. All right, then this one, neuroticism. This is sort of the how emotionally responsive are you, how much do you react to perhaps to negative events, for example. Well, they also tend to have lower risk tolerance, as you might imagine, if you're more responsive to some of these sort of ups and downs. The risk, as I mentioned, is being prone to market cycles, to loss aversion, to all these sort of negative ups and downs. Well, the ups and the downs, I guess, but more so the downs because of loss aversion. They tend to be weighted more heavily in our decision making than the ups. All right, now here, just to take a step back, we talked about conscientiousness as sort of a plus and having a rules-based approach, and here's neuroticism, which is the problem of having sort of being too responsive. Now, if you put those two things together and have, well, I'm very responsive to markets, but gosh, I've got a process that says I'm not going to do anything unless these rules apply, well, maybe it doesn't matter so much. I actually overcome the fact I'm responsive with a process that allows me to still be emotional, but it not impacting my investment outcomes. So that gives you a sort of sense of some of the complexity that sits behind these combinations. And one of the broad strategies that applies for people trying to overcome their emotional responsiveness to particularly to investment situations, is this idea of tying themselves to the mast. And this comes from the stories of Ulysses that many of you might have come across, where Ulysses wanted to hear the sound of the siren song in Greek mythology. He wanted to hear the sirens, but he knew that the siren song would attract him and he would crash his boat into the rocks and all his sailors would drown. And so to overcome this, he got his sailors to tie him to the mast. He put wax in the ears of all his sailors. All right, so they couldn't hear. He could hear, but he couldn't do anything about it. All right, so this is effectively the process. If I'm going to be responding to some type of emotional situation, and if it particularly applies to me because I'm high in neuroticism, well, can I have a process or a system that stops me from actually translating that emotional response into some sort of behaviour that's going to be adverse? And then finally, the last one is agreeableness. All right, so agreeableness, I think, is also a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, there's a benefit if you're perhaps more cynical, more individualistic, that you're going to be less influenced by the crowd. Perhaps you're going to be less prone to this sort of herd mentality of jumping on a rising market and jumping out of it when everything's going down. Yes, I think there's some benefits there because some of that herd mentality can lead to poor market outcomes and poor individual outcomes. But the flip side, I think, is also then related to, but how do you then work with other people? So looking at the decision-making research, one of the challenges is that it's very hard to overcome our own biases, very hard to identify our own biases. Everybody feels that they're not biased. But it's much, much easier to identify the biases in other people. So there's a real benefit in being able to work closely with other people who you trust and who can challenge your thinking in ways that perhaps identify some of those things that you can't identify just because it's you, but also maybe they bring diverse, different ways of thinking to the mix as well. So in the OpenInvest quizzes, we talk a bit about, well, who you're working with. Are you working with an advisor? Are you working with another individual, like a trustee of a self-managed super fund, for example? And I also sort of cover the same sort of concepts in an investment management decision-making context as well, where we're looking at team dynamics and cognitive diversity. It's the same sort of ideas of making sure, how do you get people to work together in ways that actually are super additive, are sort of synergistic, and are bringing those sort of cognitive diverse ideas together. So yes, there's an advantage in perhaps being more individualistic, but yes, if that's you, then maybe you need to think about, well, how do I work well with somebody else who can benefit my own decision-making as well. Okay, so they're the five. If you want to find out who you are, I mean, I would just Google Big 5 personality test. There's plenty of them online. You can find, you could do a couple, see if you get the same sort of results. But also, I think you probably got a fair idea just listening to those things, which ones sort of resonate with you, which ones you sort of think probably you're higher or lower on already. And perhaps if you're thinking about your spouse or other people in your team, you've probably got an idea about which ones they are as well. So I'm just going to finish off with just some of the challenges in using those sort of our perceptions of ourselves and our perceptions of others. And then I'll give you some pointers, I guess, to some online resources as well. All right, so what are some of these warnings? Right, well, the first one is fundamental attribution error. So fundamental attribution error means that other people's behavior is more related to the context than we typically think. All right, so when I see somebody, well, the example I often give is when I see somebody drive through a red light, for example. Well, I think that crazy hoon, they don't pay attention to the dangers they might be causing to themselves and to others. This is a reckless person, for example. Well, actually, the decision-making research will say, well, it's more likely than we think that there's some other contextual things that influence that person's behaviour. So they were distracted by a screaming kid in the back of their car, the sun was in their eye, they didn't see the light, perhaps they had a hard day at work and they're overwhelmed with some other situation that's going on in their life. There tends to be more related to the context than we actually think. So that's one thing to think about when thinking about other people's behaviour. The second one here is self-serving biases. So this is now thinking about our own behaviour, right? So what tends to happen is that we don't objectively view our own behaviour. We tend to view our behaviour differently depending on whether the outcome was good or the outcome was bad. So if the outcome is good, we tend to attribute the meaning of that outcome, the reason for it, to things that are permanent and stable characteristics of ourselves, like these personality traits that apply across a range of situations. All right, I've just made an investment that's gone up. Why was that? Well, it's because I'm an awesome investor. All right, I did a thorough analysis. I know what I'm doing. Versus an investment went down. Why did that happen? Well, I don't know. Trump has just, had some head-to-head with the Chinese or the North Koreans, and there's a risk off. Oil prices have crashed, whatever it is. It's not about me. It's about some external thing. It's specific to that situation. All right, so if we're systematically distorting the way we think about the outcomes, we can this actually tends to lead to more overconfidence. All the good stuff means that I'm great. All the bad stuff, well, that doesn't really matter. That wasn't about me anyway. So it's another warning, I guess, this one about how we think about our own personality traits. Now, I should say, in this case, overconfidence is one of the problems, and we've sort of touched on that as a broad problem. But one of the solutions here is feedback, getting good feedback. And in the OpenInvest quizzes, we're talking about, well, what are the processes individual investors can get to have the feedback, make sure that they're getting the right feedback, attributing the right meaning to it. But also in a professional investment decision-making context, I'm often sort of saying, well, how can we look at your forecasts and make sure that those forecasts are calibrated with reality? Are we sufficiently confident, or is our confidence exceeding how accurate our forecasts are? How can we make sure we've got all the metrics to assess those types of decisions we're making? Then another one here, and this is actually sort of relates to the interaction between people, which is, called the illusion of transparency. And this is the idea that, well, I think that you know more about me than you do. All right. So if I'm really nervous, I think that you can tell that I'm nervous. If I'm giving a big presentation and I'm feeling nervous, well, you can't tell that I'm that nervous, all right? It's not as obvious to you as I think it is, all right? So if I'm giving a big presentation, I shouldn't be concerned at all, right? You can't tell that I'm as nervous. Maybe you can if it's extreme, but not as much as it feels to me. And the second thing is that you can't tell us as much about me. Sorry, I can't tell as much about. I'm trying to get this around the right way. You can't tell as much about me as I think you can either. Have I got that around the right way? I'll have to come back and think about that more. But it works both ways, right? So there's a lack of there's sort of a gate between me and you, so that I think you know more than you do. You think I know more about you as well. And the final one is the end of history illusion. So the end of history illusion is the idea that, well, if I look back at my last, say, 10 years and think about how much I've changed over that period of time, well, I'll go, well, what was I like 10 years ago? Well, I didn't know this, I was thinking that. I've evolved a bit since then. I've changed my values, my preferences, for example. What do I think about the next 10 years? All right, when people think about the next 10 years, they don't tend to envisage that sort of change. They tend to envisage more stability than when they look back in time and think about the past. So this is the idea that the history is ended. Right now is my stable state, whereas actually there's going to be more changes, more unexpected changes, and this probably is particularly relevant for individuals who are perhaps approaching retirement or moving through retirement and thinking, what are those changes going to be? Because if I'm underestimating them, then I have a challenge of, well, if my preference changes, I don't want to set myself up with an investment strategy and a process that I'm not going to have the motivation or the time or the energy, for example, to maintain into the future. Okay, so that's all I was going to cover today. And as I say, this was intended to be a very quick, brief snapshot of some of these relevant issues. As Ravi mentioned up front, I mean, I would suggest really to go into this stuff in more detail. If you're an individual investor, would be to head to the OpenInvest website and do some of these Know Thyself quizzes. They do touch on some of the openness, conscientiousness sort of process, feedback type of issues that I've just touched on very briefly, but it will sort of make more specifically take your responses and say, well, these are the things that are particularly relevant for you. And then a couple of books that Ravi also mentioned at the outset. Now, they're both more intended, I guess, for professional investor audience, but really, I guess, individual investors who are fairly sophisticated can probably use them as well. And they're looking at, well, how do some of the biases relate to markets? How do they end up leading to momentum and to value? What are some of the problems that are inherent in groups, in dealing with information overload, in financial forecasting? And the final one there is about, which is called Cyborg, is about the interaction of humans and machines. How can you combine humans and quantitative processes? And that sort of links back to that point we were making earlier about having a rules-based approach. Sometimes having a rules-based approach can help overcome some of the decision-making biases, and that's often why the algorithms can do well in combination with humans, is they just bring some of that sort of consistency to an otherwise sort of human-centric process.